We really have an outstanding panel here to help you and help me unpack, and I hope critique as well, the work we've done on community consultations, public attitudes to security, risk and resilience, but very much through the lens of the economy and the nexus of economy and society in Australia, because one of our starkest findings in the focus groups, of course, as I've mentioned, was that although we identified heightened anxiety about security risk, we also recognise that economic hardship is the day-to-day risk that a lot of Australians contend with, more than a risk, but a reality. And of course, this does not pose any kind of enviable challenge for policymakers in government, up on the Hill, or indeed anywhere in the corridors of power and influence. I'll introduce our three speakers. I'll go to each of them with, I guess, a bit of an opening gambit, really inviting them in general terms to offer their reflection on what they think our findings mean, bringing their expertise and perspectives to bear. We've got the leads of three key institutions, three key research institutions and think tanks around the country that look every day at economics and society, but often from quite distinct perspectives. So immediately to my right, Dr. Aruna Sathanapally, who is the Chief Executive Officer of the Grattan Institute, as well as directing its Economic Prosperity and Democracy program, bringing extensive experience not only in public institution design, economic policy, regulation, but combining, government and also very much research expertise. So thank you very much for being here, Aruna. Dr. Richard Dennis, Co-Chief Executive Officer of the Australia Institute. And of course, those of you who are Canberra-based particularly would know the work of Richard and his team very well. Richard's a prominent Australian economist, author and policy commentator, with previous roles including here at the Australian National University at the Crawford School and as a columnist for the Fin Review and The Guardian. And speaking of the Australian Financial Review, I'm really pleased also to welcome Michael Stutchbury. So Michael was, of course, former Editor-in-Chief of the Australian Financial Review. Do they call you Editor-at-Large now? That's what the bio says?
I went to that and then I went on to the
Right. I was going to say, I never know what that actually means, but you know, I think a really guiding and foundational role in building the Financial Review into the newspaper that continues to have, I think, so much influence and respect around the country. But of course, after your journalism career, you've now moved to become the Executive Director of the Centre for Independent Studies in Sydney, and so you bring, I guess, deep engagement, particularly with the corporate sector, to the perspective today. So please join me in welcoming our guests, and then I'm going to go straight to the conversation. So Aruna, I will turn to you first, if you don't mind, and I believe these mics are all on for you if you want to use them. So you've had a look at our data, and Grattan, I think, has a very proud record of looking at the way in which the economic, challenges for Australia and the pressures in society intersect. We've always found your research pretty compelling. So from your vantage point, if you were trying to synthesise what we've found into your worldview, what would be, I guess, some of the immediate challenges that would spring to mind?
So thanks, Rory, and thanks for having me, and congratulations on the work. It is a really comprehensive and very thoughtful piece of work. I really enjoyed it. I've probably got more time to dive into it, but I really enjoyed what I've read so far. I mean, one of the questions that struck out to me, and you mentioned it before, in terms of future work, is what do we mean by preparedness? There's a lot packed into that concept. And so it's one thing to say, well, we don't feel like we're fully prepared. I worry. What does fully prepared look like? And it's a bit of a question of how long is a piece of string. One of the things that if we think about sort of what really lean, highly efficient processes look like, they have less contingency in them, they have less redundancy in them, which means that they are more brittle to risk. You can build in that contingency, you can build in that redundancy, whether you're talking about it for a specific company or whether you're talking about it for an entire economy. But that is expensive. It is more expensive than running a kind of just-in-time inventory or, just picking the cheapest supply chain and using that. So all of that diversification absolutely makes sense from a broader resilience perspective, but it's not without cost. And if you ask me for my big takeaway, and it's from the community consultations, but I think it's what all of us are facing. The future looks more expensive, and that's something we're grappling with. Whether that's from an environmental perspective, whether that's from a geopolitical perspective, but certainly what we've long known is the future was going to be more expensive from a demographic perspective, and then the future is more expensive in the sense that some of that productivity growth that we saw through the 20th century that meant that we could do more with less has definitely dropped off. And so insofar as we were assuming that productivity growth would continue and therefore we would continue to see that growth, those assumptions are having to be continually revised downwards. And just last week, Treasury, made public that through the Treasurer that those assumptions have properly been revised downwards again. So what does that mean? Slower economic growth and a more expensive foundation of things we want to invest in is a bit of a squeeze, right? There's less to go around, and there's more things to spend it on. So maybe that's my kind of opening.
That's a great opening, and I think that sets the scene for a lot of what will come. Richard, we've spoken not only about these issues, but also, of course, about the intersection of political decision making as well, with whether it's national security or economic policy or social policy. And there's clearly a lot of change and disruption in the system at the moment on so many levels. I'd be interested initially, I guess, in your perspective from the Australia Institute and, very clearly from the progressive side of the debate as to what you think our data means in the context of getting the balance right between economy, society, security.
Thanks, and congratulations. Again, I think it's an important piece of work. I'm glad you've done it, and I'm glad people are interested in it. But I guess for me, there's nothing sort of wrong with the way that you've done that research, but what it does is it highlights a whole bunch of structural but arbitrary binaries that I would argue are baked into Australian policy making and debate. They don't have to be baked in, and other countries don't have them, and we haven't always had them, but they're there. And they're binaries and they're so common, economy versus environment, or national security versus human rights and, freedom of speech or whatever. So we have these binaries that are just baked into the way we see a lot of big issues. And then overlaid on that, we have political binaries like left and right, because everyone knows that climate science is left-wing. Right? It's just obvious when you think about it. Right, it just is, right? It's a lefty thing. That's why Margaret Thatcher was worried about it. That's why Angela Merkel was worried about it. But these lazy habits of Australian democracy are causing real problems when things need to jump those arbitrary barriers. And I think that's what your polling highlights, that these arbitrary categorisations between security and society, defence spending and inequality, that's a great way to organise a public service. Well, maybe it is, maybe it's not, but it's the way you think it's a great way to organise a public service. It's just not how the public sees it. It's not how the world sees it, and it's not how reality sees it. So I guess my opening gambit would be that if Australians don't trust each other, and if Australians don't trust their government, then you've got no chance of delivering national security. But what undermines trust? All the things that you don't have to worry about if you're in the national security space. So inequality, people can't afford housing, people can't afford health, people can't afford education. Sure, go tell them you're going to buy the AUKUS submarines. See how that goes. Right, so the fact that you or the person sitting next to you can categorise these things quite nicely and say, oh, but human services worrying about that, I'm doing national security. those categorizations, those binaries, those ideas that the lefties want this and the security hawks want that, good on you if you think that's going to last. I don't think it is. And to give you a sense of that, and Rory and I have talked about this, but all right, when One Nation usurps the Liberal Party as the second biggest party in Australia's parliament, when that happens, One Nation are going to be on the intelligence committee that you won't let the crossbenchers onto, right? The Liberals won't be allowed on there anymore. So this idea that if you hold on tight and you keep other people out because they don't understand, it's not going to hold. And when it slips through your fingers, it's going to be messy.
So we've branched beyond economics already, and that's fine. That's fine. Thank you, Richard. That's
well, just if you think it's all about economics.
No.
But let's be clear. It's inequality and it's economic disadvantage that's driving Hanson's vote, and it's a sense that people are let down, and that's why Trump won. That's why poor people in America voted for Trump, because they thought more of the same from the Democrats was scarier than Donald Trump's whatever he was promising. All right, so these things are all linked. And of course, Australian defence and security, I don't think you really saw Trump coming, the real Trump. And yeah, but that was driven by inequality and a loss of faith in the state.
And we sure have this vortex now of international security disruption affecting everything else. I'll go to Michael Stutchbury. So Stutch, we talked a bit previously about the productivity challenge. I mean, how do you provide for all of the, or even a reasonable proportion of the national security goods that a nation might need in times of growing risk with the economy that we have? I'd also be interested, because I know that very much at CIS you connect with trying to understand the perspectives of corporate Australia on a lot of these issues. What's your initial take on our data? Where would you like to take it?
Well, thanks. And again, I'd like to say, Rory, congratulations on the big effort you've put in. Also, I found when running summits like this at the Financial Review, the trick was to time it totally with a major global crisis. And so you've managed to do that very well. That's the way you get a bit of buzz in the room. So well done you. Not sure how you did this. We
have ways.
Centre for Independent Studies is a self-styled classical liberal think tank. Actually, it doesn't have a lot to do with actually big corporates. Funnily enough, I think it probably should have a little bit more to do with that. It's a private donor. It's a classical liberal type think tank. And maybe if I put it in the context of last night at the Minerals Council, Fatty Barol from the International Energy Agency depicted this as a bigger oil crisis than the mid-70s, which I found a bit surprising, but he claimed it was a more intense thing than back then. And my own think tank, I'll do a little quick thing about the leading up to it. It's 50 years this year, and I say that 2026 is an echo of 1976. It was the collapse of the Keynesian consensus. We had the Whitlam government, we had the stagflation, and all of that in a search for an alternative framework. And of course, that framework came out of more of a pro-market, open framework, which flowed through into, say, Reaganomics in the US, did flow through into Margaret Thatcher. In Australia, it flowed through with a little bit of delay into, funnily enough, a Labor government, a Hawke-Keating Labor government, which deregulated the economy, opened it up, floated the dollar, deregulated the financial sector, got rid of tariff import protection, privatised government enterprises, and that was followed in a bipartisan way, by and large, by a centre-right government, Howard Costello government. They continued central bank independence, charter of budget honesty, which of course have gone out the window, and had competition policy reforms. And then out of nowhere came Australia's China boom, which people didn't really see coming. It was an echo of the 1960s Japan boom. We had the China boom, which came in, and so that became our new big export market. And I say that peaked at around 2011-12, with the iron ore price at around about $180 US. We went from Lee Kuan Yew calling Australia the poor white trash of Asia in the late 70s to becoming one of the world's highest income economies. Like even today, and Australians don't quite appreciate it, per capita in Australia is 10 to 15% higher than the Germans or the Swedes. It's 20-25% higher than the Canadians or the Poms. It's higher again than the Japanese or the Koreans, and that's because we're smarter than the Germans and the Swedes, and because we work harder than the Japanese and the Koreans. We've been at a high watermark of Australian prosperity, which sort of peaked at around 2011-12. Since then, I think the whole system has deteriorated. And that we've been largely arguing over what you might call the rent of Australia. So you can see politics has deteriorated. You don't have a consensus over reasonably centrist grounds about how to grow the pie. We're talking about dividing up the pie. That's the debate. And as that's happened, the global national security framework, rules-based regime for security and for trade have both fallen apart. And these are this regime, a rules-based regime, which a middle power such as Australia, a commodity exporting country of Australia, has relied upon it from our prosperity, has deteriorated. So we're now in a different world. We see now the security threats that have blown up in the Middle East, and we really haven't seen a China shock come on that front yet. And everyone's expecting that's down the pike. But we've underinvested in defence. We've now find that the global trading system has been disrupted. So there's questions about supply chains out of COVID. We have to shore up them, and there's a lot of push for national sovereignty and really going back, which has a big danger of turning into a protectionist race as well. We want to produce everything here. This will all come at a cost. We're going to have to spend more. We're a fully employed economy right now at the peak of our prosperity. China has now turned from being an unalloyed gift to Australia to being a two-edged sword because it's become a security risk as well. So and then our main security ally, the US, has become a bit unconventional. So we're grappling with all this. So I think the challenge is for a high-income economy, which doesn't really appreciate the source of its wealth, to be able to divert resources and work out how to do this in a way that something's got to give. There are trade-offs in all this, and in some ways we have to sort of shore up supply chains. In other ways, we've got to get a lot more sharper and become more and boost our productivity at the same time. So I think that's the sort of challenge facing us now, and I see 2026 an echo of 1976, not just with the oil shocks, but in the whole scope of political economy, medium-term framework cycle, and we really need to reassess a lot of our frameworks and our economic thinking as well.
Thank you, and I think you've got three sort of excellent sort of opening pieces of territory here that we can work with, and I would encourage as we go along the three panelists feel free to offer your own correctives to one another's analyses, or maybe help me push the boundaries a little bit. Aruna, I want to start with you though on the future is expensive and on the cost of resilience and the cost of preparedness, and I cannot disagree with you. I think the measures that we took from the public about underpreparedness were very clear, and this is even, I can even say this on record, even in briefing government on this project, briefing the bureaucracy, briefing Parliament as we've done in recent days. We emphasise this is underpreparedness, not complete unpreparedness. There's an important distinction there, and the question really is, what is the right level of preparedness? What is an optimum level of preparedness? And is this about being prepared for multiple shocks and risks? Are there ways in which, arguably you could look at, for example, the relative resilience of some Australian rural communities against bushfires and floods and the kinds of risks they deal with all the time? Are there lessons we can learn from there for other parts of Australia to be prepared for multiple risks, not necessarily the military stuff? Or are there very expensive forms of preparedness that are really only good for one purpose and therefore are, as you say, that high-cost contingency? What do you think?
Yeah, so Maybe I'll start from the basics, and Michael's led me there pretty well. We have high expectations in Australia. We enjoy high living standards, and we have high expectations of what government will do when times are tough. That is not a bad thing. That is a good thing, and Australia has actually acquitted itself pretty well through recent crises, both coming out of COVID and coming out of the global financial crisis. But what that has done is that has doubled down on some of the expectations we have that government will provide a floor under us when times are tough. Now, if that happens once a decade or once every 15 years, then, your economic theory or your fiscal theory would have it, you spend big and then you pull that spending back and you build your fiscal buffers back up. But if we're dealing with multiple crises, one on top of another, then we don't actually have that dynamic where we can kind of build during the good times to spend during the bad times and sort of rinse and repeat. I don't have all the answers here, but there is a piece around Australians having expectations that are both ambitious and attainable for what we can achieve collectively, and an ability for us to make the early investments in the things that we know will build our resilience in the future and not just leap from crisis to crisis. So, the way I think about it is there's sort of two sorts of crises we have to deal with. There's the shock and there's the squeeze. And, Richard makes the point about inequality, and, we've gone into the data on this, and from our perspective, the biggest driver of inequality, financial stress and long-term economic stress is housing. That is a problem that has been decades in the making. It is not a sudden shock, but its consequences will also be a long term in the unravelling. We can't lose sight of our need to act on that because we're jumping from crisis to crisis, because that's what kind of undermines our ability to then meet people's economic stress in the event of a financial shock, because it's much harder if people are in insecure housing even before we go into an economic shock. So for me, I'm thinking about how do we balance those long-term reforms that tackle housing, that maybe, tackle forms of improving productivity that are on the table, state-based regulations that we could see benefit in harmonising, while also being able to step into the fray for a shock. That is a really tough thing to ask of our public servants and our institutions, to be perfectly honest. We've done very well during crisis, often because our public service will surge to the crisis. But now I'd love to have a better metaphor than walk and chew gum, but I feel like we're entering the walk and chew gum era, where we're going to have a public service that can respond to the immediate crisis that arises in relation to fuel, but also progress housing reforms on like capital gains tax and negative gearing, and do all of that for the same budget.
Look, thank you. So, Richard, the binaries, the baked-in binaries, and I think you're right that one of the views that was surfaced in a lot of our study is that the public don't think about security in some kind of very narrow compartment. I think there was a lot of common sense in drawing those connections, but at the same time, and I'm certainly not accusing you of this, but I'm thinking, wouldn't it be nice if there was some kind of holistic policy approach that brought these issues together, that the interagency or that the federal process could somehow have integrated solutions to every problem, and they're so expensive. So what do you see as practical steps towards breaking down the binaries?
To break down the binaries, to admit they're there, by owning the consequences of them being there. I mean, we live in a country that spends $14 billion a year on fossil fuel subsidies and says it's doing everything it can to tackle climate change. I mean, pick a lane. Right? The idea that there's something, and of course to say that as a public servant is, don't, right? My advice to you is don't say that. All right? It will not help you get a promotion. All right, there's helping the energy industry grow, and there's reducing emissions, and they're separate things with different branch heads, and never the twain shall discuss. So that kind of absurdity is maintained in the farce of whatever we're doing here. I mean, to give you, productivity is going to keep declining. Here's a tip: I only forecast the inevitable. Productivity is going to continue to decline. And it's not because we're not going to fix the IR system again, or it's not because we're not going to reform company tax again. We've been doing that for 30 years. Economists think in diminishing returns. The idea that we can keep going back to the same well but pulling out a bigger bucket No chance. Climate change is going to lower productivity. But I promise you, no one at Treasury is thinking about that because that's a climate change thing.
I'm sorry, I have to interject. There absolutely is a whole team thinking about this in Treasury.
Okay, well, then the words don't make it outside into anything Chris Bowen or Jim Chalmers said. So let me give you some crystal clear examples. More storms equals more damage equals more resources used building stuff we already had. And the more resources we use rebuilding stuff we already had, the lower our actual standard of living will be. Okay? Now, we still haven't fixed the floods from Lismore. We still haven't rebuilt all the houses from the bushfires of 2000. This is only going to get worse. Now, the more activity, ironically, the more disasters we have, the more people will be employed in construction. The more construction output will rise. But our standard of living is going to decline. The more, if once upon a time 5% of crops got knocked out every year and all the labour and capital and fuel that went into making a crop that gets destroyed is lost, if that goes to 10%, agricultural productivity is just going to fall. So there are major macro drivers linking climate change and productivity growth. But go have a look at the productivity roundtable. All right, let's talk about the agenda at the productivity. Great, there's a whole team at Treasury. They sat there like this while everyone said IR and tax. So the point is these silos that are baked in, that's a left-wing issue, Richard. That's a right-wing issue, Richard. That's, you don't understand. I do understand pretty well that we're going to spend a fortune on the AUKUS submarines. That's going to lower productivity in Australia. That doesn't make it a bad thing. Okay, there's a trade-off between how much we spend on national security and market output per person, per hour worked. So when we buy $300 billion worth of subs, we're buying lower productivity. And we might want to buy lower productivity. But the Abrams tanks did not add to GDP per person. The AUKUS subs, if they ever come, I don't think they will not add to GDP per person. And the bigger the defence budget, the lower our productivity growth will be, which doesn't make it a bad thing. But we've got a narrative where productivity growth is, we pretend, our number one goal, and then defence spending and national security are our number one goal. And what our brains are trained not to cope with is what if the expenditure and putting our best brains, think about all the scientists and engineers working on AUKUS who've signed NDAs to never mention their research findings for the rest of their lives. How's that creating spillover benefits for the rest of the economy? So fine, have national security as a goal. Fine, have productivity as a goal. Fine, pretend we're trying to tackle climate change. I don't believe it for a minute. But those three things contradict each other in ways that public servants don't usually discuss.
I'm going to come back to Aruna and then I'll come to you in a moment, Mike. So please.
There's much that you say, Richard, that I don't disagree with in substance. I think that the thing that I just want to guard against is this idea that the reason that either productivity growth is slower or the reason that, we don't have a prominent public narrative about how climate change is going to affect productivity growth is because people aren't doing the hard work. I think that kind of breeds this sense of cynicism that that the work isn't being done or people don't care enough. And that doesn't ring true with me. Just to give you a very concrete example, in the New South Wales Intergenerational Report in 2021, there was a clear productivity shock scenario related to climate change that documented exactly what you talk about. And off the back of that, from 2022 through to the 2023 IGR and then the upcoming 26 IGR in the Commonwealth Government, there will be climate change modelling. Now, I appreciate the points that you make. It doesn't take away from the points that you make, but I think that...
It does take away from the points that I make.
I think...
It was not mentioned at the productivity roundtable. It was not mentioned at the productivity roundtable.
Yeah, thanks.
So, I think that there is absolutely a recognition there that the really important question is what do we do about that, right? And
be honest.
Be honest is step one. I don't disagree with that. And then the thing that follows is does that mean if we, and we're in the midst of it now in this budget, we will see lower productivity growth rate assumptions. We know that because that's been announced last week. The consequence of that is revenue growth is going to decline, our structural budget balance position is going to become worse, and then there is the real question of how do we raise the money for the things we want to do. Now, I know you've got answers to that. You say these are the taxes we should raise. Grattan's got answers to that. You know, we point to some of the same taxes and we point to some different ones. Michael will have answers to that, you know, from a different perspective. But I think that rather than having a debate about exactly what that productivity growth rate assumption is going to be, because I don't think I can get it right, I don't think you can get it right, and I don't think Treasury is going to get it right, the real debate is around those trade-offs of exactly if we agree that the future is going to be more expensive, if we agree that productivity growth is going to in all likelihood be slower, even despite our best efforts, how are we going to pay for the things that matter most? And how are we going to make decisions collectively around what matters most? Because we live in a liberal democracy and those two things have an inherent tension, right? It's democracy, we act collectively, but liberal. So there's going to be space for dissent around views of the good life and views of what government should be investing in.
Yeah, look,
I'm going to go directly to Mike.
Let me just make one point. Let's agree to disagree. We've spent decades in Australia pretending that not tackling climate change was good for the economy. Okay, we've spent decades saying that tackling climate change was a cost. That fundamentally contradicts what you just said. We've spent decades saying if we tackle climate change, it will harm the economy. So let's not do the fancy environment thing and tackle climate change. Let's not do that. Let's do the good for the economy thing.
Aruna, are you comfortable to come back to a bit later on, or do you want to? You sure? Good. So, Michael, you've firstly, I've libelled you by saying that the Centre for Independent Studies is the creature of big business. So I'm very glad that you've set the record straight.
Wish it was
there. But secondly, I don't think I need to ask you a question because there's already quite a live conversation here about particularly the productivity challenge. How do you see it?
Yeah. Well, look, I wouldn't agree with Richard that the climate change costs are what's driving the fall in productivity that we've seen, the flat line for the past decade. Most recently, it's the expansion of the low productivity care economy, and the size of government it's grown by at least 3 percentage points of GDP. We've reached a new plateau, a record high plateau of about 40% federal and state government spending, a record high plateau in the economy. We've pulled more regulations into all walks of life. We're re-regulating the labour market, including just the anti-productivity and anti-competition things such as patent bargaining that has been imposed upon the labour market. Now, they might not have bitten a lot yet, but that's where I think the productivity slowdown has been, and we just need to get a much more sharper, more market signals economy like that. I'd say if you take, say, it does mean, though, that we probably need to spend, and Australia can't really affect the overall climate ourselves. Doesn't say we shouldn't take part in global action that should try to do that, even though you'll find that, I think, stepping back a bit, you'll see around the world, the real push for net zero by 2050 will step back a bit as a result of what we're going through here and the slowdown in sort of economic growth and the shock. But we should spend more on, for example, adaptation in Australia. We spend very little on adaptation compared to other things we spend on. But if you take the current oil price shock we're seeing going on now, you might predict that out of that we'll see an uptake in electric vehicles. Probably more for cost grounds and security grounds and perhaps for pure people wanting to save the planet, for example. There'll be some of that, but you'll see an uptake of that. I think you'll see a push for more liquid fuel security, where we've really brought home that liquid fuels, basically petroleum and oil, still matter a lot for the global economy and for everyday life. And it's more than just driving around your car. It's for the whole operation of all industry. Now, at some stage in the future, that might change, but it's still, a very, very big thing. If we run out of liquid fuels in Australia, the whole place is going to grind to a halt. And that's the thing that's on everyone's mind in business right now. The next month or so, am I going to run out of oil and petrol and diesel? So we'll see a push for more fuel security. But then the question becomes, how much more? Because we've relied upon this high area of globalisation on being able to, we export gas and we can import crude oil and we can refine some of it. Most of it comes in refined as well. And we've relied on a globalised trading system to do that. How much can we rely upon that in the future? And there will be a push coming from It won't be, if you like, the progressive left this time, but it might come from the sovereign populist right to have high levels of sovereignty, of sovereign capability, of total self-sufficiency in liquid fuels. It costs a fortune. This will be a push for all of this. It's a limit. How much more sovereign capability should we have in liquid fuels, petroleum, fossil fuels that we need to keep the place going? And then thirdly, I'll say, I think there should be a push for we should become more forthright in asserting ourselves, as Barol said last night, to becoming truly where we can be an energy superpower. We've talked about becoming a clean energy superpower. The government doesn't talk about that anymore. It may come down the track, but gas, we have a real ace in our hands, and we've had a passive-aggressive attitude to gas. We celebrated 10 years ago that we were going to become the world's biggest LNG exporter. A Labor government celebrated that. That's gone very passive-aggressive since then, and we've tried to restrict the use of gas. We've put probably our domestic electricity system at a little bit of risk at that, and we haven't taken on the ability to be able to say, as a part of the free world, quite frankly, the world of democracies, we can become a much more reliable supplier of a critical fuel for the transition, for the clean transition of gas to especially Northeast Asia, to our friends Japan and Korea and so forth, and make the world less reliant on, say, Russian gas, where the Europeans have fallen foul on. So we could become and get some strength from that if we sort of focused on what our strengths are.
Before inviting panellists to keep this alive, I'm going to go to the audience and take a few questions from you. So if you've got any, if you like, counterbalancing thoughts to each other's interventions so far, save them for the responses to the audience. I'd like to take 3 or 4 questions from the audience. So if you do have a question, we have 1 or 2 roving microphones, I believe. Get my attention, and I will try to begin harvesting your questions. And I will begin down the front. Please introduce yourself to the group, if you don't mind, when you ask your question.
Hi, thanks, Rory. Paul Myler, straight Q over in Perth, and a distinguished advisor here. One of the things,
a survivor of the Australian Public Service as well,
and a survivor of the Australian Public Service. One of the things that I found interesting, which I'd like your comments on, is the finding in the report that that came through pretty clearly, that the community understood that the scope of our national interests was so broad that we could not afford to protect them ourselves, and so that relying on partners and allies was a really important part of the ecosystem of making this trade-off of cost and benefit sort of thing. How does that, I have a role advocating for AUKUS with the Australian Submarine Agency, so we have opposing views on that, but that for me was actually really reassuring that people, despite what we might have seen in terms of a sharp increase in concern that roughly aligned with the re-election of Donald Trump, that underlying that there was an understanding that Australia's just had a breadth of interest that we couldn't afford to protect ourselves.
Paul, since you're there and since you've disclosed your various roles and affiliations, do you have an observation you can share about, AUKUS and, if you like, the economy, national infrastructure and so forth? What would be an observation you'd make in that regard?
A couple of things. First of all, we talk about national security as insurance policy, really, isn't it? Submarines are the ultimate in deterrence. What are we trying to protect? The fact that we're the 5th largest user of commercial shipping in the world, the fact that 98% of our information travels through submarine cables, the fact that most of our wealth is contained either offshore or comes through very narrow harbours up in the northwest. There are a whole range of reasons why, and the report pulls this through. The public is very conscious that there are single points of failure in terms of how easy it is to block off fuel to sink a ship in Port Hedland, to block, the one railway line that connects us to Darwin or connects Perth to the rest of the country, et cetera, and that at least for the offshore part of that, submarines are a really good insurance policy. And I think my take out from what I hear in community consultations in Western Australia and what I've seen in some of this work and other work is that notion that we understand there's an insurance policy and that's important is actually pretty deep-seated right through the community.
Thank you. Let's take 2 or 3 more questions. And I'm actually going to go towards the back of the room where, for some reason, the younger and student members of the audience seem to have congregated. So please go ahead and introduce yourself.
Hi, I'm Darcy. I'm a student here. Australia has spoken a lot about critical minerals production. We offered it to the Americans in October for continued support for some of our military and economic linkages. It's also one of our comparative advantages in the global economy. The report showed that 74% of respondents viewed critical supply disruption as a serious threat to Australia's national security. And the sort of dichotomy against that is that 88% of Australia's mining companies are foreign-owned. I guess my question to the panel is, how do you believe Australian industry and government and society, for that point, how can they mitigate risk associated with foreign ownership in important economic sectors like critical minerals production?
Thank you. We'll take a few more. Let me see more hands at the back, if I can. Right at the very back, if you don't mind. Yeah. Thank you. Just gives us some thinking time.
Hey there, my name is Rachel and I'm a student, hello, but also I work at AusTrack and I've been around the public service across most portfolio agencies. My main question was aligned with that one. In layman's terms, can you tell us your views about this disruption to the supply chains? Can you talk about what your views are about what's important and also along the lines of self-sufficiency, sovereign capability, somebody mentioned it there, but around, growing your own vegetables, having your own chickens, like Australia. Can you talk about all of that? Thanks.
Thank you. Canberra's the right place for that. I'll take one more down the front and then we're done. I think we'll give you 4 a real smorgasbord to choose from here.
Hi, I'm John from Defence. I have a question on the interaction between the prosperity agencies and the security agencies. So there's many investment opportunities out there that aren't quite viable for business, but also aren't quite viable for the security agencies, defence or other prosperity agents, or security agencies to do themselves. 2 examples might be, say, Cairns Airport, upgrading facilities, or the Gascoyne Gateway over in Western Australia, where there could be a benefit for both the a trade investment economic return as well as a resilience return, and they're just not quite meeting the criteria of either one. And so the question is really, does government have the right processes to respond to business calls for investment where that small subsidy, beyond, say, what the Northern Australia Infrastructure Fund is doing, to basically harness those opportunities where there's a combined benefit? Thank you.
Thank you. Aruna, why don't you kick off?
Yeah, so look, maybe I'll start with the last one first. I think it is well demonstrated through the history of the 20th century and before that governments have to adopt a really rigorous and sceptical position towards business calls for investment. There are really good reasons for that. Not because of people's bona fides. I don't doubt that many people genuinely think that that little bit of investment will really unlock a public benefit. But if something doesn't stack up commercially, then we have to be really assiduous in putting public money towards it. Not because we shouldn't, but because there are many such calls. And what the record shows is that vested interests tend to extract higher returns, not based on merit, but based on their networks and connections. And so you need to have really high standards of probity in the way in which your public service is making those resource allocation decisions. Not that you shouldn't make them, but you should make sure that they're at arm's length from political decision making, they're at arm's length from anyone who's giving money to government, and one of the things that might not be very popular, but I will say is that often there might be a strong geographical constituency, but that doesn't represent the public interest of Australia as a country. And that is often really hard in a system of representation that is highly geographical, where a particular community might say, well, this will absolutely benefit this part of South Australia or this part of Western Australia. But if you were to apply an equivalent lens, there'd be an equivalent project in every part of the country. And so it's just one of the things that I'm not against kind of industry policy. I'm not against public investment in things that don't stack up commercially. But I think you need to have the highest standards of probity because of the demonstrated dangers of money going to things that have people who have greater political power and not necessarily the most meritorious. So if you can figure out a way to kind of get the most meritorious uses of those funding, then fantastic. To the point of self-sufficiency, I think, again, if I'm going to kind of set my camp in the sort of some of the economic dries, chickens and growing your own vegetables, fantastic. But once you start really working that through to the complexity of modern supply chains, it is very hard to imagine us having anything close to our current standard of living in a world where we manufacture more things domestically, where we rely on only the minerals that we're able to source domestically. I hesitate to use such strong language, but it feels like a bit of a fantasy to me. In reality, even the smallest consumer goods that we use benefit from source materials from many parts of the world and a construction process that is deeply embedded. Now, we could unpick that. I don't know why we would, but we could unpick that. But it's a world where we have a lot less, and we are effectively poorer. In material terms, but probably in terms of medical materials and therefore health quality and a number of other things that we all care about. So then I come back to this, the really excellent intervention at the start is I wouldn't jump to an assumption that there is a large contingency of Australians who want us to retreat from the world. I don't think the facts show us that at all. We are actually quite an open and we're a population that faces the world, and I think faces the world with confidence. I think that's a great strength of ours. The fact that one or two of our allies might become more reliable doesn't apply to our many other allies, and I think that adopting a posture where there is a greater network, a diversified set of diplomatic relationships, a network of middle powers that diversifies those supply chains is a much more productive angle for us to be working than an idea that actually what we need to do right now at this point in history is retreat from the world.
Thank you.
Look, let me try and kind of combine those questions a bit, and I'll sort of slightly restate some of the things I've said before. I haven't said today what I think Australia should do. It's a democracy. We should do whatever we want. No, like literally, like that's the point. I get called left, I don't care. I get called all sorts of things, I don't care. I'm speaking to you as an economist. There are opportunity costs with our choices, and we hide them. We hide them from ourselves, we hide them from each other, and the silos in the bureaucracy hide them very, very, very effectively. I don't care if we build submarines or buy submarines or not. I don't care. I don't think we'll get them, but I don't care. I've never heard someone who's an enthusiast of AUKUS say, and here are the taxes I want to increase to pay for it. I've never heard an advocate of AUKUS say, here are the spending cuts I want to pay for it. Who do I go to find how we're going to pay for them? Whose job is it in Australia to explain that we're going to cut health, education, age pension in order to fund the subs? No, it's rhetorical. Let me finish. All right? Whose job is that? So the farce, that's what I'm calling out, the farce of saying, oh, we couldn't possibly spend more on, I don't know, aged care because where would the money come from? Oh, because debt. Oh, because interest rates. Oh, because. Fine, true. I'm an economist, I get that. None of that is applied to defence spending. Let's just own that. All right, and if you want to have, Morrison came along and said, hey, everybody, lead up to an election, I got a lazy $360 billion to spend, didn't go through cabinet. Oh, opposition, what do you reckon? Yeah, I'm good, done. Within 24 hours, we had bipartisan consensus. No one mentioned where the money will come from. Own that, just own that, but understand that the public sees that. That breaks down trust. People think, oh, hang on, when they want to spend money on their stuff, there's plenty of money. But when I say, could my life be nicer? Could my kids be nicer? Could you build some public housing for me? Or where would the money come from? So this weaponised use of technocratic arguments against poor people and the silencing of that technocratic language when powerful groups want their things, people see it. They might not articulate it as clearly and as pointedly as I am, but that's why I assume Rory invited me here. So call me a lefty if you want. I'm just talking about cash. And I didn't say productivity growth is slow because of climate change in the last 10 years. I said it's going to be slow for the next 50 because of climate change. We're going to get less output per unit of input when we're spending a fortune on seawalls. What's the long run rate of return on a seawall? We're going to get less output per unit of input out of all sorts of infrastructure when we have to build it higher, build it bigger, build it stronger. These are opportunity costs. This is economics 101. And again, maybe someone in Treasury is beavering away on it, but it did not get a mention in our so-called productivity roundtable. So opportunity cost, economics 101, sits underneath all of these choices, whether or not we build a bigger airport, whether or not we have more self-sufficiency in petrol. It's all opportunity cost. But the farce of Australian policy debate is we don't talk about opportunity cost when we're doing good things. And by good, I mean things powerful people want. But the minute low income earners, the minute people desperately in need of help say, can I have some help? What about the debt? What about the deficit? You're destroying trust in the whole system because of the asymmetry in the way you weaponise technocratic defences of government in some senses and completely ignore them in others.
I'll come to you in a moment, Michael, but I think Richard, the opportunity cost question, which I think is at the core of so many of the issues that were surfaced in the data we have, of course, that doesn't only apply to particular defence programs. It can apply within any spending on anything associated with any kind of national security. And it's going to be interesting, as you say, in the years ahead to see whether these arguments can and should be applied to climate adaptation as well.
Look at the rise in the ASIO budget, compare it to spending on defence and security for people against artificial intelligence.
You're playing binaries here, aren't you?
No, I'm saying that no, I'm not at all. I'm saying that we spend big on some threats and we spend nothing on other threats, and people see it.
Yeah. And that's, look, I think certainly one consistent finding across the report is the desire for more openness and information. Michael?
Yeah, look, I think you can have an argument about AUKUS. It's a legitimate argument about all the ins and outs and that, but I think it's pretty clear Australia's going to have to spend more on fairly conventional defence budget in the disrupted world we're in. So we've got to deal with that one way or another. I think we've got to cut back a lot of, quite frankly, wasteful government's expenditure, and we need to boost productivity by going back to, I'd say, to put it in Australian terms, going back to a Hawke-Keating, Howard Costello type agenda to get a more productive economy through more use of market signals, smaller government, lower taxes, and to drive an economy so that you can have an economy that can have the resources to defend itself, to secure itself, and also look after the disadvantaged. And that's the sort of challenge we have here. And as Aruna says, governments should be wary of businesses, special pleading for these sort of handouts as well. Businesses also need to be wary of governments because the governments have very specific political goals, and we see this right now. Australia's lost our cheap energy advantage. That's what we gained in the 1970s with the OPEC oil shocks. We had plentiful cheap coal. That gave us a great cheap energy advantage. And all the smelters you see throughout Australia now were largely built in this era where we had our cheap energy advantage. Now, for whatever reason, you can argue about that, we've now lost the cheap energy advantage, and we're now responding to subsidising all these subsidies. So if you take especially the aluminium smelters, you take the Rio Tinto one in Tomago, we've just come out and we're just basically giving it a blank cheque to keep that going. Rio basically wanted to close it because they didn't think it was economic anymore. They'll probably go to Canada where they've got the cheap hydropower. It's been a political decision to spend hundreds of millions of dollars, It goes, and it's going to go through snowy 2.2. Hilariously, because the digger, I think, is still stuck in might be still stuck there. The cost of that's totally blown out, and so it'll end up on the public debt. It gets sort of it's a money shuffle and ends up there. So we've decided through a political process, without any real public process, hasn't gone through a productivity commission analysis or anything like that, to spend a lot of money keeping that smelter open, and we've made a political call on that. Just as a lot of the infrastructure projects, Melbourne Suburban Rail Loop, now we're committing a whole lot of money to a very fast train to Newcastle. None of these have really gone through proper cost-benefit things. So I think we've just got to get more, the political process needs to get much sharper about where we spend the money. And that's basically what we need to do.
Can I, in a moment, I want to answer the question on critical minerals that Darcy asked. So a quick, if either of you have a quick response, and then we'll.
No, I wanted to take Michael's point to that because I forgot to mention the foreign ownership critical minerals thing. The first thing to understand is we didn't lose our cheap energy advantage. We literally gave it away. So gas used to sell for about $3 a petajoule, and then it was landlocked on the east coast, and we built enormous gas export facilities in Gladstone. Cost $40 billion to do it. That linked our east coast gas market to the world market, and the price of wholesale gas tripled. So we didn't lose it; we gave it away. That was the plan. That's fine. Again, just let's all own the consequences. So we had cheap gas and free market economics, which I'm not opposed to, said, you know what would be better is to sell it abroad at the maximum price we can. So we created trade in gas where it used to be landlocked. And the link between, so we didn't lose it, we gave it away. It was the plan. We didn't accidentally.
We sold it for the highest price.
Exactly.
Which is like we used to ban iron ore exports in Australia.
But I'm not disagreeing with you, Michael. I'm just
wanted to keep it, and we became wealthier as a result.
Right.
And now we export close to 1 billion tonnes of iron ore.
Right.
And that's the one reason. That's probably the one single reason why we're the prosperous country that we are today. So we could have kept on banning the exports of iron ore exports, but we chose to sell it to the highest bidder.
Right.
That's how you become a prosperous nation, which we are today.
And that's why our gas tripled, right? So we didn't lose.
And because we put supply constraints all over the place, we're extracting more of it, particularly in this.
Production's tripled as well. But anyway, these are foreign-owned exporters, which again, I'm not anti-free trade. I'm not anti-foreign ownership. I'm just someone who owns the opportunity cost of our choices. We used to have landlocked gas. It was very cheap. There was lots of industry that used the cheap gas. Then we had a better idea. We'll let people export it at the world price. The price tripled. It's a choice we made. It comes with consequences. A lot of that manufacturing is no longer viable with the prices that we chose to allow. Now we're in a new kind of, gas or energy crisis. We talk about Australia exporting gas. Australia does not export gas. Chevron exports gas. BP exports gas. Impex exports gas. Woodside exports gas. Australia doesn't. Santos. So we can list them all. This is not Australia.
I assume you're listing some Australian companies there.
No, well, companies like Woodside are majority foreign owned. That doesn't matter. But B, this is not Australia's nation state exporting gas to another nation state. This is not a nation state exporting gas. These are private contracts. So here we are at a point in world history where everyone else is playing geopolitics and we're playing free trade. And we're playing free trade with privately owned companies. So in terms of what are we going to do with rare earths, etc., we're going to look after the foreign-owned owners of the rare earths. We are not going to have an Australian, and I'm not saying we should, but just own it. Let's just own it. We are not going to say we'll have the Australian cartel of critical minerals or rare earths, and we will figure out how to maximise the value for Australians from it. We are not going to do that. We're going to let a random collection of foreign-owned companies make those decisions, and we'll shovel some subsidies onto them. Now, that might be fine, but it's the opposite of what other countries are doing right now.
Before we wrap up, but I think Michael, you may, or Aruna, you may have an observation on the critical minerals question. There is also the interesting intersection, of course, of perhaps taking, as you say, an approach, a market-based approach domestically, but at the same time building a sense of interdependence or a sense of dependence with middle power partners and allies, whether it's Korea, whether it's Japan. So presumably there are some geopolitical benefits that government perceives from this, rightly or wrongly. Michael, do you have a comment on the critical minerals?
Yeah, and I think in forming alliances with other, to use the phrase, the middle powers is totally a good thing, in which we've been doing, and with Japan and Korea and others. Given that our main security ally has gone, a little bit rogue from time to time, so
although the critical minerals is very much aimed at cementing the relationship with the United States as well.
Totally, and so, but at the base of it, there is no real alternative to the American alliance as the bedrock of our security. So I think that's got to be understood. The critical minerals is a good opportunity for Australia. I don't think it really matters, the amount of foreign ownership in these sort of things. I don't see that as a big issue. We've had companies like Lynas formed already out of the geopolitics of China and Japan and critical minerals and the security of it. We're doing now, we've got an agreement with the Americans, the one done in Washington, D.C. earlier in the year, and to process all of this. I think that's a good thing, that we don't have a stranglehold of one main producer in the world, China, even though it's our biggest export market. It's a good thing for us to diversify, and in the reality of the geopolitics of today, that's a good thing. It'll involve a bit of government sort of direction and help along the way. I think that's the world we live in, and it's a critical here and now thing. And these, it's not the massive amounts of money that that are involved in some other things, but it's a good thing for us to do, and that's one of the ways in which we can become usefully into basically the Western Alliance.
Critical but not massive, perhaps.
Yeah.
Aruna, I'm going to give you the last word. We're almost at time, but if there are any of those issues have provoked some conclusions?
Yeah, it's just one, and it's a broader observation, because maybe I felt a little bit sad during some of that conversation, a bit depressed, and I just want to kind of lift up from that a little bit, because I think it's worth thinking about the fact that you talked about national security involving hard choices. We absolutely have hard choices ahead of us, but there are few countries I would rather be in making those hard choices than Australia. And just in terms of some of the economic fundamentals, yes, the future is expensive, but we also have lower public debt levels than most of our peers. We have a lower tax to GDP ratio than more of our peers. Others of our peers, I know Michael's concerned about the sort of the scale of government spending to the size of the economy. I'm less concerned about that given our demographics. I actually think that it's not particularly out of sync with our standards of living or our age profile. Our age profile is also better than a lot of our peers. We have a community that I think is happy to face the world, and from your work is prepared to have that conversation. And the thing I'd come to last is we do actually have strong institutions in Australia. We have incredibly low levels of corruption, for all my points about vested interest. We do have a history of reform, and we also have a history of good responses to crises that have acquitted us well. So maybe just a call for some optimism in terms of our ability to handle those hard choices.
Thank you for ending us on that confident note. I think this has been an incredibly rich discussion. I think this is probably one of the least prepared and least war-gamed discussions of the conference, and it shows. It was dynamic. I think we all learned something. We were all challenged. I hope we all have had our assumptions challenged, and we go back to track the insights from the community consultations data against the different schools of economic and social wisdom that you've heard here today. So please join me in thanking our panel.